How's it going, everyone? Welcome back to Boylai Hobby Time. I was once again at my local hobby store and I found some miniatures and I wanted to make a diorama with them. I found a few other miniatures. I wanted to make a diorama with these also. Then I found these, and these, and these. I couldn't decide which one I wanted to add to a diorama first, so I decided to just use all of them first. I have been around the wargaming hobby for a very long time, but if you can believe it, this box right here is the first box of anything Warhammer I've ever opened. Anyway, this is also the first box of Perry miniatures that I've ever opened. This is also the second box of Perry miniatures I've ever opened. I've opened lots of boxes of these Games Workshop Lord of the Rings figures. That's actually what got me into wargaming. And Star Wars Legion is how I got my start on YouTube. The Legion models come in these little baggies instead of on sprues, which is interesting to me. My initial plan was to start with the Space Marines, but after looking at these instructions I got a little overwhelmed and decided to start with the other kits first. The Stormtroopers just have 1 or 2 pieces each, so I got those glued together real quick and I popped them on some bases. These will just help with ease of painting later on, but I will take them off before putting them on the diorama. There is a subtle difference between these two Numenorians. Let me see if you can spot the difference. One is very chill, and one has absolutely no chill. I did actually decide not to use the men and elves, and instead use some Urukai because I felt like they fit the vibe of the diorama just a little better. Next I assembled the knights. I started with the horses, and each half of each horse is interchangeable with another half. And there are also a lot of different head options to choose from, which makes for a lot of excellent combos and configurations. Once all of those were together, I had the makings of a complete carousel. Next, I glued the horses onto some bases for stability and painting purposes, and then I added the knights on top. Just like the horses, you can mix and match the body parts as well as the weapons and accessories, so in the end, no two knights are the same. I really enjoyed building these knights quite a bit. I then assembled World War II figures, which were pretty standard, but had some nice detail and went together pretty easily. After that, I moved on to the Space Marines. I started by gluing together the torsos. Then I gave each torso a pair of legs and a pair of weaponized arms. After that, I glued on their heads and their backpacks. After I had thrown those on some bases, that was the assembly of all of the miniatures done. Okay, the idea that I had at this point was to have the Space Marines in the center of the diorama with all the other armies around them ganging up on them. I imagined that the Space Marines would absolutely dominate in a free-for-all, so this felt the most fair. After I had taken the miniatures outside and primed them, I set them aside and it was time to move on to the terrain. For the base, I used a 12-inch by 24-inch sheet of plywood. I cut some planks of poplar to create the perimeter of the base, and glued and sanded everything. Next, I threw on a sheet of XPS foam. I trimmed it to size by cutting off the unsightly ends, and I glued it to the wooden base using some foam-safe superglue and some CA accelerator. To build up some elevation on the terrain, I decided to use some styrofoam because it's cheap and easy to work with. These are all offcuts from a previous build. I then shaved down the edges of the foam with a hot wire to create some hills, and I tried to vary the terrain and elevation to create a little bit more compelling display for the figures to stand on. I then used the pointed tip of my hot foam knife as well as my hobby knife to shape and sculpt the foam into some rock texture on all of the steeper areas. Once I was happy with the rock surfaces and the texture, it was time to move on to the terrain paste. The terrain paste is made from plaster, paint, and Mod Podge. The paint makes it easier to see where you've applied the paste, and the Mod Podge helps it stick to the foam better, as well as making it less brittle. While it was super thick and chunky, I used it to fill some gaps, and then I watered it down and brushed it over the rest of the surface. This will dry nice and hard and protect it from later steps. Once the paste had dried, it was time to add some texture. I started by spraying the base with a spray-on adhesive, which is nice and tacky and will hold the sand and pebbles and keep them from falling off when I put them on. I started by adding some pebbles to everywhere that pebbles would naturally be, and then I added some sand to everywhere that sand would naturally be. Also covered everything in isopropyl alcohol and watered down glue between each layer, and I left that to dry. Then it was time to paint the armies. I started with these World War II minis, and I gave them a base coat of Army Man green and a bluer green for the pants, and I sprayed a light olive green directly from above. I painted the details on, like the boots and the belts and the skin. I tied the paint job together with a light dry brushing and a dusting of some tan with the airbrush. After those were all painted, I snapped them off their painting base, and it was time to move on to the Stormtroopers. I was inspired by 52 Miniatures Stormtrooper themed Space Marine and decided to paint these Stormtroopers like Stormtroopers. I used a variety of colors, including black and white for the armor, black between the armor for their weapons and the soles of their shoes. I then dusted up their feet with some tan, and it was time to move on to the Urukai. These Urukai are the Urukai scouts from the end of A New Hope that run off with Merry and Pippin. They wear mostly leather and have less armor than their Helm's Deep counterparts. Viggo Mortensen actually broke his toe while kicking one of their helmets in the Two Towers. I dusted them up with the airbrush, and I also painted on a white hand of Saruman onto their shields and moved on to the knights. Given that all the knights were different, I decided to paint them all differently as well. This one right here got the 350 black-red plus chainmail colorway. The army was a bit shiny after dry brushing it with a metallic silver, so I dulled it down with a bit of dusting from the airbrush. The last army to paint was the Space Marines. Because these are my first Space Marines, I decided to paint them with the colors of my favorite fish, the Centropage boilei, or peppermint angelfish, which is not to be confused with Goobertown Hobby's awesome clownfish soldiers that I saw recently. You may have heard of blood angels, but these are the peppermint angels. And while the peppermint angelfish that they are inspired by is pretty gentle and cute, these bad boys are not gentle nor cute. Once all the minis were painted, it was time to set them aside and finish the base. I took the base outside and I primed it, and I began the painting. Unfortunately, most of the texture I added in that previous terrain step, and much of this painting became unnecessary after I decided to cover most of it up with static grass. I do like the static grass look though. It was a nice change of pace for me. I usually build stuff in desert, arid or semi-arid settings, especially at this scale. So the nice hilly green grass highlands look was a lot of fun. I also like the contrast of this somewhat serene landscape being the setting for this epic crossover battle. I added a few other colors of flocking to add a more natural look to the grass, and I sealed everything with isopropyl alcohol and watered down white glue. Once I had the terrain done, it was time to figure out the placement of the lights. I dry fitted the minis into their positions, and I found the spots that I needed to drill some holes for the wiring. I fixed one filament directly to one of the minis that was getting hit, while the other two were attached to figures that were doing the firing. I glued some rods in place to hold the filaments nice and straight, and I ran the wires down their legs to their feet. I tested all the circuits to make sure that they were good, and I moved on to the base. I marked some holes in the bottom of the base, and then I drilled a hole through the wood, and I used a stiff rod to push through the foam to the surface. Then I glued the wires to the rod, and I pulled everything back through the hole. I connected the minis to the wires, and then I connected all the wires to a battery and a switch that were hidden in the base. Then it was time to put all of the miniatures into their places permanently. After the minis were in place, I glued on some shrubbery that were gifted to me by Diorama Presepe, and the very last thing to do was to paint the sides of the base with black 3.0. After that, I called it good. That is it for this video. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Huge shout out as always to my patrons. You guys are the best. Have an awesome week, everyone. I'll see you next time.